Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. On today's episode, we're going to be covering Unit 8, Cold War and Decolonization of AP World History. Also, a quick note, today is the last episode of the AP World History Review Series. So if you want to check out any of the earlier episodes for the other units, you're free to do so. So here we're going to be starting off with setting the stage for the Cold War. There were many influences of World War I. Empires like Austria-Hungary fractured between Germany and the Ottoman Empire. And Irish and Korean declarations of independence represented nationalism and decolonization starts, where they sought self-determination. Next is the impact of World War II. World War II hit Western Europe the hardest due to economic and physical turmoil, and allowed the rise of superpowers like the US and the USSR. The US and the USSR emerged as dominant world powers with strong armed forces and boosting economies. When we talk about the actual Cold War, it is important to note the pre-Cold War period. The Yalta Conference was a meeting of Allied leaders, notably Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and the purpose was to discuss the reorganization of post-war Europe and the defeat of Germany. The Potsdam Conference was when US President Harry Truman and the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee discussed the future of Germany and the issue of reparations. However, both these conferences failed to result in resolutions from both sides. There were many tensions between the United States and the USSR. The US was a capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, leading to both sides seeing the opposition as a threat to their beliefs. The US wanted to rebuild Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan, and the Soviet Union wanted to spread socialism and communism and establish puppet communist governments in Eastern Europe. The US followed the policy of containment. The Truman Doctrine was a US policy that established the principle of containment, which stated that the US would provide military and economic aid to any country threatened by communism. Containment was the US policy to stop the spread of communism. The domino theory was a US theory that if one country falls to communism, neighboring countries would soon follow. For example, when Vietnam became communist, the US was afraid that the same would happen with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and eventually India. The Marshall Plan was when Eastern European economies were crashing, and the US offered capital to these countries in an effort to bring them under capitalism and further employ their policy of containment. The non-aligned movement, which was a result of the Bandung Conference, where mostly third world countries vowed to stay neutral through this agreement, was led by Indonesia and Ghana and allowed newly independent countries to focus on their own developing economies. There were many effects of the Cold War, most notably alliances, rising tensions, and proxy wars. There were many alliances created during the Cold War, the two most notable ones being NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was composed of Western countries formed to counter the threat of Soviet expansion and to support capitalism. The Warsaw Pact composed of Eastern European countries under Soviet influence and was formed as a military alliance to counter the formation of NATO. There were many rising tensions after the Cold War. The space race was when the United States and the Soviet Union competed for spacecraft production during the Cold War. After the Russians launched Sputnik, which was a satellite, the US successfully conducted Apollo 11, and both sides perceived these actions as a threat. As in, if something could be put into space, they could also blow up the world. The Berlin Wall was the wall between East Berlin, which was communist, and West Berlin, which was capitalist, and was created to stop people from openly traveling across the border. The Berlin Airlift was when the Soviets blocked off trade and communication with the West, and US and its Western allies had to airlift supplies to the citizens of Allied-controlled West Berlin. The Soviets soon ended that blockade after seeing a successful US attempt. Next came proxy wars. These were conflicts in which two opposing powers avoided direct military confrontation by supporting opposing sides in a third world country and provided aid to these allies. There are many examples of proxy wars, most notably the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Angolan Civil War. First was the Korean War. At the Potsdam Conference, Korea was split into two sides between the 38th parallel, a communist-backed North Korea and a UN-backed South Korea. North Korea desired to unify Korea under communism and launched an attack on South Korea. After reaching the border, they pushed in further until South Korea, with the help of the UN, pushed them back past the 38th parallel. when North Korea and Chinese communist soldiers once again pushed South Korea to the 38th parallel. The war ended in a stalemate and both sides declared ceasefire. Next was the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh was a North Vietnamese communist leader who declared independence from the French and defeated them at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. At the Geneva Conference, Vietnam was split into two sides between the 17th parallel, a communist-backed North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and a UN-backed South Vietnam. Both sides wanted to unify Vietnam and declared war. The United States soon joined with South Vietnam under the policy of containment. The Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front, were South Vietnamese who supported communism and fought a guerrilla warfare against the US troops. Vietnamization was the US policy of removing troops from North Vietnam and foreshadowed the eventual US withdrawal of troops from the island. And lastly was the Angolan Civil War. The war began when Angola gained independence from Portugal. A socialist MPLA and anti-communist UNITA were the opposing sides. The Cold War politics further fueled the conflict in the area, as the Soviets and Cuba supported the communist MPLA and the US and South Korea supported UNITA. The spread of communism was huge during the Cold War. One example of this was the Chinese Revolution. The Chinese Revolution overthrew the Chinese Democratic Party and forced them into Taiwan. Sun Yat-sen led this revolution. Nationalists then took power and established the Kuomintang, which battled for political control against the Chinese Communist Party. The May 4th movement was a cultural and political movement that emerged in China in 1919 and was sparked by national humiliation and the unequal treaties. Next followed Tiananmen Square. It was where students who were exposed to democratic ideals led an anti-communist protest, where the communist government crushed the rebellion. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and soon made its way into China. China's Mao Zedong, following Stalin's five-year plans, also implemented five-year plans for China, where Mao implemented collectivization in agriculture and forced peasants onto communes, or large estates. The great leap forward was Mao Zedong and the Communist Party's effort to bring economic changes. The goal was to rapidly transform China into an industrialized society. However, the poorly planned implementation led to widespread famine. In Ethiopia, Mengistu Haile Mariam converted Ethiopia to a communist regime, nationalized industries, and collectivized agriculture, which led to the widespread human rights abuse. The Indian state of Kerala elected a government that legitimized the peasants' right to cultivate land and abolished the British zamindari system. In Iran, after World War II, the Iranian leader considered supporting the Nazis. However, Russia and Britain invaded Iran to stop this and forced the leader to abdicate the throne to his son, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Iranian nationalists objected and selected Mohammad Mossadegh as the PM. The United States and Britain overthrew him and re-established the Shah to power. The White Revolution was when the Shah led aggressive modernization reforms. He forced landowners to redistribute land, increased federal funding, encouraged industrial growth, and also recognized women's voting rights. However, after this, many Islamic conservatives opposed modernization as it went against the Sharia law. This led to the Iranian Revolution, where leaders opposing the Shah's secular worldview established a theocracy, which was a government based on religion. Lastly was reform in Latin America. The general trend of peasants taking over dispossessed states to cultivate continued. In Brazil, peasants added taxes in large land tracts, and Chile encouraged peasant farming on large plantations, which all reflected communist ideologies. After the Cold War, many decolonization movements followed. India. Britain promised India independence, however, they never followed through, which increased nationalist sentiments. After this, the Indian National Congress was created. It was an organization that gave Indians a say in colonial matters. It was led by Mohandas Gandhi, who led non-violent protests in India. In 1947, India was granted independence and was split into two countries, India for Hindus and Pakistan for Muslims. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was a nationalist who led the independence movement against Britain. Civilians of Ghana refused to cooperate with the British and boycotted British goods, and Britain eventually negotiated independence when Ghana declared its independence in 1957. Kenya, they began agitating for independence, but were way more violent than India and Ghana. What followed was the Mau Mau movement. It was an anti-colonial uprising in Kenya, made up of members in the ethnic groups who opposed British colonial rule. They carried out guerrilla warfare, when thousands of lives were lost of both Britishers and Africans. After this, Kenya gained independence in 1963. French West Africa, building nationalism after the World Wars led to protests that resulted in the French passing Loi Cadre, which allowed local governance. In Algeria, decolonization also occurred violently through armed struggle. The National Liberation Front was an Algerian nationalist group that led a guerrilla war against the French and won. They also led the French government to seek a negotiated settlement, an agreement that granted Algeria independence. Nigeria was the Biafra secessionist movement. It was a campaign led by the Igbo people, or the Christian tribes, to establish the independent state of Biafra. The Nigerian movement rejected the secession and launched a campaign to retake the region, resulting in a 3-year civil war. Biafran forces were eventually defeated, and the region was reintegrated into Nigeria. Angola declared independence from Portugal, but Portugal sent troops to subdue this uprising. War followed, but was cut by a short coup in Portugal. And after Angola gained independence, the power gap from decolonization led to the Angolan Civil War. There were many newly independent states after these decolonization movements. First was Israel. Zionism was the desire of the Jewish people for their own Jewish homeland. Looking back at World War II was the Balfour Declaration. It was a document that announced Britain's unwavering support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As the mass migration of Jews continued to Palestine, the already existing Arab Muslims in the area felt threatened, as they believed that the Jews were staking control on their holy land. The United Nations then created Israel in 1948, which was carved out of Palestine, which increased Jewish migration. Conflicts rose as both countries claimed holy right on the land. For example, the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War. Cambodia. Authoritarian leaders in Cambodia fought for power after the French left. However, political chaos led to the communists gaining power under the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge was a brutal communist regime that ruled Cambodia under the leadership of Marxist dictator Pol Pot. He carried out the Cambodian genocide to bring forward the Cambodian master race. And last out of the main three was Pakistan. It was created largely due to the creation of the Muslim League in India. The Muslim League was a group of Indian Muslims under Muhammad Ali Jinnah that called for Muslim Indian separation from India, as they worried that the Hindu majority would overpower Muslim interests. After India was partitioned, Hindus and Muslims had to migrate to their respective countries, leading to the death of about 2 million people. The economic systems in new states were as follows. In India, under Indira Gandhi, who was the second Indian Prime Minister, India nationalized banks, insurance sectors, and the coal industry. It represented one of the more extreme examples of government intervention in the economy. In Egypt was General Gamal Abdel Nasser. He overthrew the king and established the Republic of Egypt. Nasser advocated for Pan-Arabism, which was the belief that all Arab countries should be united and together. Nasser's policies blended Islam and socialism. He instituted land reform and nationalized some industries. When it comes to the Suez Canal, it had been under lease to the French, but the Egyptians viewed it as a colonial exploitation. Nasser pledged to fight this, and the Suez Crisis soon followed. Nasser seized the Suez Canal. Israel invaded Egypt, and Britain and France surrounded the canal, claiming to enforce a UN ceasefire. The US and the Soviet Union were angered because they believed that the seas interfered with international trade and had the threat of opposing political ideologies spreading in the Middle East. The Suez Canal officially became an international waterway under Egyptian control. In Sri Lanka, under Sirimavo Bandaranaike, who was a Sri Lankan politician who served as the world's first female prime minister, promoted free enterprise, and under her leadership, the wealth gap in Sri Lanka declined greatly. The term metropoles is very important to know during this time period. After colonies were freed, many people from those colonies migrated to their mother country. For example, Indians to London, Filipinos to the United States, and Algerians to France. There were many global resistance movements to power structures, and most notable out of these were conflict responses. In Spain was Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain, who was fascist and received support from Axis powers in the Spanish Civil War. He oppressed many political opponents by using a secret police network and established the only safe religion to practice as Catholicism. In Uganda, under Idi Amin, who was a dictator who expanded the Ugandan military and used it for whatever he wanted, Uganda expelled thousands of tribes and Asians from Uganda. They targeted ethnic groups he perceived as a threat. However, when he fell from power, the country was left with a dissolving military dictatorship. There was many weapon trading that was going on during this time period. Countries increased their arms storage and traded them to increase national security. Instead of making the world more peaceful, it instead became more violent. The mass trading of weapons also made nations more warlike. There were two types of movements that followed in this period. There were violent movements and non-violent movements. First was the formation of Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was the founder of Al-Qaeda, which was composed of Islamic extremists and Salafist jihadists. It was originally founded to fight off the Soviet Union, who supported the communist Afghan government. Jihad is a term that refers to the holy war for Muslims to fight off invaders in a Muslim state. Al-Qaeda saw the US as a target because it supported bad governments, for example Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and led to the declaration of holy war on the US and eventually the 9/11 attacks. Jihad refers to the struggle that Muslims experience, internal struggles, rejection of Satan, and the preservation of Islam, and it doesn't encourage terrorism. When it comes to non-violent protests, Mohandas Gandhi, MLK Jr., and Nelson Mandela are the three key figures. Gandhi popularized the concept of non-violent protests. He believed that violence only worsened injustice. Through hunger strikes, boycotts, and peaceful protests, Gandhi led India to independence. The Salt March, for example, was a 240-mile journey into the Arabian Sea to protest against British salt taxes. Inspired by Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. campaigned against segregation in the United States. He believed that nonviolence only emphasized the anger of the racist whites and the police, which would draw nationwide attention to the cause. South Africa. Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary who served as the president of South Africa and played a key role in the fight against apartheid. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation, specifically in South Africa. The African National Congress was created and was a political party that fought this apartheid. Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years, and after his release, he worked to negotiate an end to apartheid and a transition to democracy. As president, he promoted social justice and economic development, land reforms, and job creation. What followed was the Soviet Union's collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev was the Soviet premier who implemented reforms aiming at modernizing the country and promoted glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was transparency in the Soviet government. Perestroika was a reform that allowed some private ownership, which reflected mild capitalism. Arms race and nuclear production exhausted Soviet finances as they spent more money to keep puppet governments in power. Glasnost and perestroika led many Eastern Bloc countries to desire independence. Gorbachev's policies upset the communist branch, who attempted a coup. Political and economic situations got even worse. The communist economy couldn't provide enough resources to their citizens, leading to massive social upheaval. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall officially fell, which symbolized the end of the Cold War. Negotiations between the US and the Soviet Union continued, and both countries signed START, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It led to the reduction in nuclear weapons, and Russia soon became a federation and elected Boris Yeltsin as president. Cold War soon started to thaw, as US military and technology advances began to slow down. Last was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. As part of the Soviet bloc, Afghanistan experienced heavy Soviet influence and had a communist-leaning government. Due to discontent with the government, coups erupted, and the USSR attempted to maintain control by invading Afghanistan. This led to the formation of a Mujahideen, which was an army of Muslims. The Afghani Mujahideen resisted Soviet invasions and made them sign a peace agreement, leaving the Soviets in massive debt. This concludes the AP World History Review series. If you enjoyed this series, be sure to follow Fine Print for more episodes.